So this week we're going to finish chapter 6. I'm going to just let you guys know next week I won't be here. Dewey will be leading the prep class, and then it'll be back to me after that. But, yeah, I have to edit that out now. Anyway, so I also have a lot of slides this week. So I'm going to hope that I can get them through and not distract myself. So we'll see. This week's great is, again, in quotation marks, kind of building off of Friedrich Nietzsche last week with the Übermensch philosophy. This week we're looking at, I know his last name, Sumner, but William Graham Sumner. He was the first sociology professor in the United States, but beyond that, he kind of coins the term social Darwinism and starts applying it to humans. Originally, it was a term that they started trying to use in like business practices to point out why businesses should be able to take over other businesses and why monopolies are good. And it's that same time when Carnegie and Rockefeller were trying to buy everything that moved in the country. But he was the first one applied to humans, and he kind of gets to the same conclusion Nietzsche gets to, and that is humans have to act dominant, and it's not always the best ideas that win. It's the ideas that are loudest or can bully the other ideas out of the way, and that's how you get great ideas, is by having the strongest, or I guess most animalistic tendencies you have. But that is not at all how Christ preaches. So we're picking back up in the middle of the Sermon on the Plain. And this week's, before we get into reading, this week's guiding question I put down is, how would Christ respond to our modern culture that is so focused on competition and being better than one another? And so we'll go ahead and start reading. So if someone would like to read chapter 6, verses 27 through 36.
I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Whoever hits you on the cheek, offer him the other also. And whoever takes away your coat, do not withhold your shirt from him either. Give to everyone who asks of you, and whoever takes away what is yours, do not demand it back. Treat others the same way you want them to treat you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do the same. You lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners in order to receive back the same amount. So love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he himself is kind to ungrateful and evil men. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful.
All right. So a little bit of, I guess, painting the picture. He's preaching this to a crowd, and a lot of people would consider, or whoever's standing next to them, very possibly one of their enemies. And so I kind of included some pictures, and I'll walk them through around it. We have Greeks, we have Pharisees, Sadducees, Romans, Jews, Zealots, tax collectors, and Samaritans. None of these guys like each other. They are always looking for one reason to better themselves over each other, whether that's in physical combat with the Greeks and Romans, whether that is intellectual debates over the Torah with the Zealots, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees, whether that is it's purely racial differences with the Jews and the Samaritans, and no one likes the tax collectors. So you're kind of sitting there, and these are people who are just in a crowd. And I'm sure as he's preaching this, someone's looking over and giving a mean face to someone because they're like, I can't believe so-and-so showed up. How can Jesus be preaching to this crowd? And you could think all these people are in this presence. Beyond that, we also have people from just very different geographic areas. I included this map in last week's slides, but again, it's emphasizing we're bringing in people from the northernmost point in the Jewish world down to the southernmost point. So we're kind of getting a mixing pot of all mixing pots. And I'm sure just as there's little differences between someone from Wisconsin and someone from Alabama, there's differences between someone from Tyre and someone from Bethany, just because it's a completely different world, just geographically. And so as Jesus is preaching, he's preaching pretty out of the ordinary stuff for some of these groups. For the Greeks and the Romans, this idea of you need to love one another. It's not necessarily written in their scriptures, but one thing that is important to note, it is in the Jewish scriptures. So both the Jews and the Samaritans would recognize this, because in Leviticus 19, verses 17 through 18, it reads, "You shall not hate your brother in your hearts, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself, for I am the Lord." Leviticus likes to end its legal statements by, "This is from the Lord, your God." So that's just a side note there. But so Jesus is preaching something that the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Zealots, a majority of his crowd would have immediately recognized as, oh, we're talking about the law of Moses. We're talking about the Old Testament. And yet it's kind of funny to see the Sadducees generally, when Jesus references the Old Testament, kind of have a out because they only read the Torah. So they only read Genesis through Deuteronomy. Everything else, they're like, yeah, it's good writing, but it's not scripture. And so it's similar to how Jews say, yeah, the New Testament's good writing, but that's not scripture, in, I guess, modern terms. But what we have here is Jesus is pointing to an example, because there's plenty of examples in the prophets and the stories of David and the Proverbs that kind of get to the same idea, but he's going straight to a point that everyone who is a Jew should be able to immediately recognize as this is something central. And he kind of expands on it. It's not just your neighbor or your biological brother. It is everyone you come into contact with. Those who you consider your enemies, you are supposed to treat as your brother, which it's not in Leviticus. I think it's in Deuteronomy, is mentioned that way too. Because I've included it in our handout. The same kind of message that Jesus is preaching here shows up in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, and so will how he kind of ends this section. But what we have going on here is a reminder that just because you're against someone doesn't mean you should actively be wishing them, I guess, spiritual harm. And it's the reminder of treat these people as if they were your brother or your neighbor who you're commanded to and you genuinely have compassion on. I don't know about you. Even when I had my brother or sister who really annoyed me, I still didn't want to see them really get harmed. I just was frustrated with them. It's beyond that. It's everyone you should have that same general compassion and care for, just as you would your own brother. I'll stop there before we move on. Does anyone have any comments from these first couple of verses?
Well, that's pretty radical what he's saying there. Very, very radical. He set the tone, I think, and just when you think about it, when we say, well, we want to love like Jesus loved, you gotta consider this, that's pretty convincing.
All right. And then Jesus goes on, starting in verse 32. He kind of, I guess, clarifies what he means when he says, love your neighbor. It's not just love the neighbors who like you. And he brings up this idea of you're to love those who hate you and those who do harm to you. Because if you're just loving those who love you and who do good things for you, well, even the sinners who never have heard the scriptures, those who have never really interacted with Christ or God, even they do that. Looking ahead into Romans, when Paul's writing, I guess it's still going on because it's that weird one viewpoint's dying out and the other one's just starting out. And so there's a lot of scholars who debate, but it's the idea of, well, did the Greeks just happen upon doing good, or it was written on their hearts because of Christ? And so I'm getting off the track, but it's the idea of, well, Jesus pointing to Greeks can happen, or Gentiles can just happen on doing the right thing. That doesn't mean that they actually knew what was right or wrong. Those who are in sin, those who are actively doing evil, even they will do good to those who do good to them. And so just by doing that, you're not setting yourself apart. And so we're starting to get this idea of building off the Beatitudes and the pronouncement of woes from last week. There's something different about following Christ. It's not just, yeah, we're following the law and we're being good and loving our neighbors who like us. Well, you're supposed to also be liking and loving on your neighbors and being compassionate to those neighbors who cannot stand you, and you may not have the patience some days to stand them, but you still have to love them. And so we're starting to see Jesus is fleshing this out, and kind of putting, I guess, setting coals on someone's head of, you may think you're doing all that is right, but you still have a few more steps to go before you're really doing what I've asked you to do. And then in verse 35, he's bringing this back again, kind of echoing the Old Testament with Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. And he's love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Some translations say give without expecting anything in return. And that's again getting to another passage, which I include from Leviticus, which is Leviticus 25, verse 35 through 38. If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though if he were a stranger and a sojourner. And he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. Again, we're getting to this idea of everyone, even the sinners, would say, yeah, I would give you food if you needed it, but I'm going to expect something for return. I'm going to expect that when I'm hungry and I come to you, you're going to feed me as well. And I think what we're seeing here is Jesus is also mentioning, yeah, the Pharisees and Sadducees and the Zealots, they all know the law and they've read it so many times, but they've read it so many times and that they've kind of become detached from it. They're no longer really paying attention to what's going on here. They're just saying, well, yeah, that was however long ago. I guess back then it would have been, okay, that was 1,000 years ago instead of now almost 4,000 years ago. And we kind of do that the same way with some of our Old Testament and New Testament passages. We're like, well, yeah, that was good for then, but like now, what do we say? And we try and we read it so many times that it starts to lose meaning. And we allow it to lose meaning because that's easier for us to get away with things he's really just meaning don't like be harsh to your brother and take care of them when they're in need. He didn't really mean that we shouldn't expect anything in return. Because if we were to follow it to its logical conclusion, well, if it's my turn to be the one who's in need, well, I'm then allowed to expect that he also feeds me because I fed him. That's not really what the text in Leviticus or what Jesus is saying here in Luke is. It's you are to give and care for your neighbor, your brother, your enemy, and expect nothing in return. Even if you gave everything you had to this individual, it's not guaranteed he will get it back. It's not guaranteed that he will even be better off, but you're still supposed to give. And so
we justify not giving sometimes by saying, are we doing him any good?
exactly.
You know,
Jesus would
not
say,
learning anything.
you are doing good because you're doing what I've asked you to do. And so we're kind of running into that again. But does anyone have anything from this section before we move on? About doing good to your enemies, giving everything without expecting a reward or anything in return. All right. Well, your silence means that I'm going to guess you're going to teach it exactly this way in class, and that's great. But we'll go ahead and move on. If someone would like to read verses 37 through 42, we'll move on to the next section.
And do not judge, and you will not be judged, and do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Pardon, and you will be pardoned. Give, and it will be given to you, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over. They will pour it into your lap. For by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return. And he also spoke a parable to them. A blind man cannot guide a blind man, can he? Will they not both fall into a pit? A pupil is not above his teacher, but everyone after he has been fully trained will be like his teacher. And why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when you yourself do not see the log that is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take out the log of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take out the speck that is in your brother's eye.
All right, thank you. So this section is kind of one of those, I'm going to go off on a side note, and I didn't include this because I didn't want to go on this side note, but I wanted to anyway because I kind of do want to go on this. This section is one of those that people are really confused by because it doesn't make any sense. And so you have some scholars who say, well, this is clearly not the same sermon Matthew heard, because Matthew would not have put it in this order. If Matthew and Luke heard the same thing, Luke must have missed a whole lot for this to be put in the order it was. Really, it doesn't make a huge difference if it was one sermon or two between the two gospels. But this is still a good section. I think the thing that throws everyone off is that portion in that last portion of verse 38, when it says, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. That doesn't make any sense to an English reader, and that's okay, because to the Greeks, it would have made a little bit more sense, because the Greeks can kind of get away with things in the Greek that we can't get away with in English. So a few things that are going on here. One is describing a process that we're not used to. We don't go to a marketplace and watch people pour things out. So I'm going to have an object lesson for us this evening to kind of prove what's going on here. But before that, the Greeks also have this cute thing in their language where they can just leave out the subject and pronouns and names, and because it's implied by the verb. The verb shaken, poured out, they would start to see, oh, this is something that's being measured like a grain or a rice. or bean or dirt or whatever, that's how it's being measured out. And they would immediately go towards that idea. But like I said, we don't see that in our practices. Like you don't go to Walmart and just start pouring things into your cart because one cart is wired basket. It all just fall on the ground. But even then, they don't just let you open bags and start pouring it. Anyways, so our object lesson, I brought some rice. I'm gonna need either one of the Steves to help back it up for those in the back. Here's a bag of rice. Is this 4.5 cups, Steve?
Is it?
Is it 4.5 cups?
No.
But the line, it marks up to 4.5 cups.
I don't think so.
All right, so in the marketplace, you have people who would try and say, well, see, it fills the cup. See, it has to be the full amount of the measure. Well, no, it's not. What you'd actually have to do to make a good measure is pour it out. I'm not gonna pour out the whole bag, but you pour it out. All right. Steve, is that? Well, pour it this way and look at where is it? Is that 1.5 cups of rice?
No,
But it meets the line.
it's still not.
It's still not. So even though it's poured out, it also has to be shaken around and leveled out to be matched up to the real amount, which is actually 1 cup. So you'd still have those who are trying to, well, Steve, I have to charge you for 1.5 cups if I didn't shake it out. And if I didn't pat it down, there might be more room you could get out of there. And so it's that idea of a good measure goes through the process of exacting that. But what Jesus is describing is, well, actually, I'm going to now pour more out into this bag, if I can get it. But I'm only going to charge you, oh, I'm making a mess. But I'm only going to charge you for the 1 cup of rice. Because that's how we're supposed to get. That's how we're supposed to be giving out grace to one another. It's this idea of you need to be giving more, building off that last passage, than is expected of you. You shouldn't be greedy and trying to force Steve to pay an unfair price for what's not there. And so it's that idea of when you're judging someone, don't be quick to judge. Be quick to give out grace and ample amounts of grace because God gives that out to you. And he kind of hits that on the other side of God isn't going to cheat you out of your portion. If you have earned an abundant amount of grace, he's going to give it to you. You don't need to cheat someone out or try and trick God into giving you more than you deserve. God's going to give you exactly what you deserve and then some. And you can take that however you want, whether it's he's going to give the wicked what they deserve and then some, and he's going to give the righteous what they deserve and then some. That is something that Paul kind of wrestles with in his epistles. But we're also seeing Jesus then apply it of, as God does the same thing to you, you need to be giving out just as much grace and leniency and have patience with those who hate you, those who are your enemies, because your enemies will cheat you out of, they'll force you to pay 4.5 cups of rice for not that much rice to begin with. Or they'll try and put their thumb on the scale and, oh, you bought more apples than I really counted here. You need to pay up. But what you need to be doing is, I guess, being the one to lighten the scale, be willing to give more.
Concept of baker's dozen,
Yeah, the baker's dozen. You're
throw in an extra one.
exactly. I kind of ran into that. I worked at a grocery store for forever, it felt like, which a year in a grocery store feels like an eternity. But there was one lady who came in and she had like, I think it was 2 nickels, a dime, and a quarter. So that's 50 cents. I don't know. 45 cents. That's right. My bad. Yeah. Anyway, 45 cents, and she's trying to buy like 2 oranges with it. Like, and well, one, the price for an orange is not 45 cents because we're in the middle of nowhere. I guess it's not nowhere, Texas. It's the edge of nowhere, Texas. Yeah, you can see the empty fields for a while, but if you look the other way, you can see a bustling metropolis. But it's the idea of like, I could have called my manager over and told her, no, you can't buy these 2 oranges. And I know it's bad for me to say this, but I just rang up 45 cents produce and let her walk out of the store with the 2 oranges. Cause it's the idea of like, this is all she's eating is 2 oranges for the day. And she's coming by with probably all she could find. Even if it cost me my job, I would have been able to walk away and say, okay, I'm fine with what I had to do and what I did. Because, and I'm sure Jesus would say, yes, you did the right thing because you're doing, you're giving more than what you were supposed to. You're giving out of abundance. You're showing compassion and grace. And so, yeah.
Kind of it's in a different lane, but the same concept is used, and I forget where it is. I think it's in the Old Testament, maybe in Malachi, but it's talking about giving as such, but it uses the same phraseology. It's with measure you measure out, it will be measured to you. I had a preacher one time did an illustration on that, and he had different size scoops, and he started out with a little bit of scoop, and he said, just testing this out, said, so you get the scoop and you go around and say, give, 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 give. God takes the scoop from you and he gives to you. And so, oh, let me get this bigger scoop. And give, 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 give. God takes that scoop and gives, give, gives. And he did about 3 of those. And then after that, he pulled out this huge scoop and he said, give, 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 give. And, but the point is, God, you can't outgive God. You're not gonna ever be as gracious and as merciful as God, as loving as God. But man, we need to try, and we need to use those big scoops.
Yeah, and the idea is, you can't give your life for the salvation of the entire human race.
Yeah.
No, I can't do that. My quote can't do that. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't give at all.
Yeah.
We should still give, and we should still be dedicated to ministries and mission work and all the other things, and being compassionate to our neighbors, helping whoever we can. And so I hope that cleared up that first half. And then Jesus goes, or Luke records like 6 parables and squishes them all into one. And it's kind of all hitting on the same point of your brothers, or there's 2 brothers, or there's a teacher and a student, or there's just 2 blind men. There's still learning for a teacher to be done. The teacher doesn't know everything. The student definitely doesn't know anything. And so you have this idea of, in each parable, no one knows anything really. One may think they have a better idea, but they're still falling short of the glory of God, as Paul would put it. And so it's the idea of, if a blind man who knows nothing is fleeing another blind man who also knows nothing, and is just walking along their way, they will stumble and they will fall. One, because blind men can't see. So them trying to lead one another, I think would be kind of comical, but in a not so Christian way. And so I need to not find it comical when people fall down, especially little kids, but it is still pretty funny. Anyway, I'm getting off track. And then we have, a teacher can lead the student, but a student shouldn't be the one leading the teacher, because then they'll stumble or they'll be doing the wrong thing in their judgment. In the same way, a brother who has a log in their eye, they can't be the one to pick out the specks in other people's eyes. They may want to. It may be really annoying for the guy with the log to see all these specks in their brother's eyes. But it's also super annoying, probably to their brother or whoever's with them to say, listen to them and say these things to one another. And while this guy has a huge thing stuck in his eye, and he's very much not on the right path or whatever. And so it's that idea of hypocrisy will say, well, yeah, judge everyone regardless of what you've done. And Jesus says, no, we're supposed to be judging everyone as you want to be judged. We need to be giving each other that extra slack because the Lord knows we need that extra slack, especially on some days we need more extra slack than others. But that means we also need to be willing to give everyone else that extra slack when they need it too. So does anyone have anything they want to add to this section before we move on?
One of the things I kind of lean on or try to focus on, try to keep everything in concept. And I may have to go back. I'm going to definitely go back and read this and try to do that. But and we see this later in Luke, in his one parable after another. He does a crescendo. He builds on top of this. So leading here, he tells us about loving our enemies, but then he says, "Be kind and be kind to ungrateful and evil men. Be merciful, just as your Father's merciful." Then he steps into do not judge. He goes through that. Then he talks about blind men. You can connect all of these together and build on that to his climax about in the last part of the chapter. You know, is that what you're going to?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
No, you're good. It's good to see the pattern. All right. So if someone would read verse 43 through, I guess, 45, we'll go ahead and move on.
No good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes or grapes from briars. The good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart, and the evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For out of the overflow of the heart, his mouth speaks.
All right. So we've kind of already seen this analogy in Luke a couple times. The first one,
No, just clear my throat.
the first one we see is with John the Baptist in his sermon. With John the Baptist, his main concern was, are you a tree that is producing fruit or not? Whereas now Jesus is kind of building off of that of, okay, you're a tree that's producing fruit. Are you producing good fruit or the right fruit? And it's not the idea of, well, there's certain trees that just shouldn't produce fruit, or but they need to be producing the right fruit. And it's kind of building off I think Jesus is hitting here of, if we want to take this as he's talking about spiritual gifts, great. I think there's an argument to be made there, but it's the idea of not everyone has the same spiritual gifts. Not everyone can have or do the same things in the kingdom. And we're kind of talking about this with the Mexico City mission trip group. Some of them really want to be the leader, but they don't have the leadership skills to lead a group or one of the mini groups, I guess. And so it's the idea of, that doesn't mean you can't be a leader. Some people just need to grow into that. But then there's some that just should never, ever be a leader because God says, yeah, you're really good at other things, but not leading. I'm calling you to not.
You can't have leaders unless you have followers.
Exactly. And then so it's that idea of not everyone's supposed to be a teacher. Not everyone's supposed to be doing mission work. Not everyone's supposed to be doing that. It's good that we have those people, but we also need people who pray for one another, who can give to the church and support these missionaries and support these groups. And I'm sure you've experienced this in some of your classes, There's those who probably don't need to talk as much in class and probably need to listen more. And then there's those who probably need to talk more, but they're just really good at, they just really want to listen, and their job should probably be speaking up. And so we kind of see that here of Jesus is saying, yeah, the thorn bushes, they have their fruit that they produce, but it's not a fig. They have a job, but it's not to produce figs. Fig trees are supposed to produce figs. And a fig tree is not supposed to produce apples. And that's the job of an apple tree. And so not necessarily trying to like bash people's spiritual gifts here, but it's the idea of there's a role in the kingdom. But he also talks about whether you're an apple tree or not, say we're all apple trees. What then he moves into is, are your apples good? Like, are you producing good apples, or are you letting your heart and your mind and your soul and your spirit be overrun by evil so that your fruit becomes bad? So this is kind of where the argument of, well, he's talking about spiritual gifts kind of falls apart, because it's more of just talking about what is your, what does your spirit do? What is your, when no one's watching, are you filling yourself with good things, or are you filling yourself with bad things? Because even though no one's watching, that doesn't mean it's not going to come out. Because out of that excess of evil or that excess of good, that's what's going to come out, and people are going to realize, oh yeah, that's not good fruit, or that's not, or that's evil fruit. And so I think I've kind of done that, but I also feel like I've just talked in circles. Does everyone else follow along or have another way of thinking about this?
So are there people who are innately evil? Or innately good? Because
That is a great question, Steve.
And that's why he brought up Pharaoh.
Yeah.
He brought Pharaoh to caused him to have a hard heart. Or at least
Yes.
that's my understanding.
It's a weird line, because you want to say definitely no, but also definitely yes. Because, but you also don't want to say there's a gray area, because then you're like, well, God isn't really like, God's one thing or he's not in the gray area. And so, but then again, there's also like, if we were to put God in this room, there wouldn't be enough room for us, and then there wouldn't be enough room for the rest of God. And so we're kind of running into this barrier of, well, I don't know how to answer you, Steve. You could easily say there are more evil people than there are people who have more evil in them than good. And there's definitely people who have more good than evil. But I don't know how, if that answered your question, or how definite of an answer you want. But
what was the question? Or
are
that
there
people
people
are
who are innately evil or innately good?
born evil, born good?
Or just bankrupt evil?
You're born either way.
We all have a choice. I mean,
Yeah.
it depends on what happens to us. I do a lot of good things, but it doesn't mean that I can't do a lot of bad things. That I make a choice not to do those things, to act on them. Because I have a moral compass that focuses on God and what he wants. Well, not everybody has that, so therefore the choices aren't as relevant to them on some things that they do.
No, yeah, and some of this depends on where we take the conversation, but Paul would say is, we've all sinned and we've all fallen short of the glory of God, therefore we're all evil.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
plain and simple, if we weren't all evil,
Yeah.
we don't need Jesus. And so I think that's, but born good, born evil, I don't know if it's even the right question, you know, in that sense. I mean, I think that We've all sinned, we've all fallen short of the glory of God. If we didn't need a savior. And since we need a savior, then I would say that we're all in some ways evil in that sense. But
And part of it is also, I guess, no one's innately good but God. Because you can't just be good enough. You'll always still fall short because we're humans, we have errors. And so building off that idea of we can't ever achieve being God. We see it a lot of in the Old Testament of it's kind of a play on how Genesis opens of God says, let us make man in our own image. We see a lot of the characters in the Old Testament say, let us make God in our image so that we can become gods, or let's build a tower to heaven so that we can be like God, or let us eat of the tree of the fruit of good and evil because we want to be like God, or well, surely you won't die, or this just comes up over and over again. Humans have errors, and so we can't be perfect like God, but we're also not like incredibly evil. Steve Hightower mentioned the idea of, well, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. It wasn't Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and God just said, Pharaoh, you have no choice in the matter. You're just going to do the evil thing. It's God made it really easy for Pharaoh to choose the evil thing. And not saying that God was trying to necessarily force people into evil, but
He knew their hearts.
He knew their hearts, and he kind of going to Job, he let Satan tempt Job in the same way. He probably let Satan tempt Pharaoh into thinking, oh yeah, why should I give away my slave force? Because Moses says God says so. It would be really a shame if I said no, and then 10 plagues happened, and all the firstborn sons of Egypt died, and he was like, oh yeah, I picked the wrong side on this one. And so I think it is, no one's.
You mentioned Job too, but I like the last part of Job where it says, God says, where were you when I made all this?
Yeah.
And so sometimes we just gotta sit back and let God be God.
Yeah. And so I think to better answer your question, Steve,
All the time. Not sometimes, all the time.
we are both not one, but we're also not one. And this is that idea from Augustine of there's a one and there's a not one, because it's the idea of absolute evil isn't negative one, because that's still somewhere between one and the absolute opposite of one. And so humanity falls somewhere in between, and it doesn't mean they're never redeemable. It also doesn't mean they're never, they're absolutely perfect. They're somewhere in between absolute goodness and absolute evil. But I think I just confused everyone else. So,
Well, the reason I say that is, when you look at Judas Iscariot,
Mhm.
he saw all the perfect good in the world, but it never changed his heart, right? So, and then you take someone who is just morally good all the time, and they do everything right. They're not church, they're not a Christian. They just do everything all right. I mean, they care for the needy, they give to the poor, they stay in the spirit. I'm just curious. It's always kind of been a puzzle to me. It's how Judas Iscariot could be in the presence of God incarnate, right, and not change his heart to it. So it's just a question I had. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate your answer. Thanks, Brad.
I think too, with that particular verse, if you kind of pan out to look at some of your other verses close to that context, you come across that principle of, if you're trying to make a change in your life, or wanting to allow God to make a change in your life, it's not good enough to just take bad out, but you also have to put good in, taking the plank out of your own eye, but then also making sure that you're putting good things into your heart, so that from the overflow of your heart, those good things can also come out, which is, I guess I more frequently for that concept to kind of reference Luke chapter 11 verses 24 and following, where Jesus talks about the spirit being cast out of someone, and it looks through arid places for a place to live. And when it comes back, it finds the house that's swept and clean, but still empty. And so that spirit grabs 7 others and goes back into that same person, and their condition is worse than it was to begin with. So it's not just good enough to, take the plank out of our own eye, or just look at how we can try and help someone else take specks out of their eye, but make sure that we're also putting good things into our hearts, so that from that overflow, good can be seen.
Which kind of fits in with, I guess, the season we're in. Today is Ash Wednesday. For those who observe Lent, this is the day that they try and start off basically a New Year's resolution of, yeah, we're gonna cut this out for a month. Plus like however many days until Easter. The joke is, at least at LCU's Bible department, is we will not be using the Quran during Lent. Not that they were using it before, but it's that idea of, and we kind of poke fun of it, and it's kind of become not really what it's meant to do. But it's the idea of some people will give something up, New Year's resolution for Lent, for they just want to be trying to do better, but they don't replace it with anything. My grandma's a smoker. She smoked most of my life. There was like a brief period where she really was adamant about giving it up, but she never filled that need, that, I guess, whatever drove her to smoke, with anything. So she's right back to smoking again. And she always like, I want to give up, but I can't. She tried to quit doing evil, but she never filled it with anything good. She never filled it with something that was good for the body, good for the soul. And so when we do, for some people who are struggling with sins and they just keep doing it over and over, and they say, I want to get better, I want to get better. Well, part of it's, have we equipped them to fill it with good? Or at least told them that they need to be filling it with something good, and not just another thing that makes it worse, because then they're just going to be worse off than they were before they try to give it up. And so I thank you for that. Any other comments before we get to the very brief last portion?
So is smoking a sin? Okay, I'm asking just for being argumentative.
If it causes you to weaken your relationship with God, yes.
Okay.
So quit.
Yes, sir. Well, I'm just, I'm just, we're kind of going there, so it's, so if somebody's smoking, they're sinning, in essence. And that's the question, are they okay with God? Probably so, right? So we classify those as big sins, right? But what about taming the tongue?
Yeah.
Or being just downright surly every day. So I just think it's gauge, and it's all my gauge to God's gauge.
Yeah.
That's my point. I don't smoke. I don't try to think I did. I did dip tobacco when I was playing softball. Sorry. But I'm no longer doing that. I hadn't done it for a long time. But was I okay? Absolutely. Because it was, it was nasty habit, right?
Yeah.
But I just said we gotta walk that fine line of saying that.
Yes.
I love your grandmother.
I had a fellow workmate one time, after I made a comment about smoking, she said, I'll put down my cigarette when you put down your fork. I go,
Yeah.
got a good point there.
Yeah.
Because I always overeat.
It's easier for me to put down Copenhagen than it was to put down my fork to eat.
All right, we'll go ahead and finish this last section. So if someone would like to read verses 46 through 49, we'll go ahead and close out today's lesson.
Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? I will show you what he is like who comes to me, hears my words, and puts them into practice. He's like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on a rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house, but could not shake it, because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed, and its destruction was complete.
Thank you. All right, I didn't put a whole lot in the outline for this, because I felt like everyone in here would know it. Because we've only been through children's school, and like, y'all's kids have been through it, and some of y'all's grandkids have been through it for years now, and this seems to come up like twice a year, if not more, because it's a really easy one for teachers to teach to little kids. And so I had no doubt you guys would know it, but there will be some who may be in your classes who don't know this story super well. That's perfectly fine. That's why we're here to teach it. But I think we've all kind of gotten to the idea of Jesus saying in this parable of, you say you know me, you say you're doing the things I'm doing, but if you were really doing the things I'm doing, you'd be doing diligence and you'd be building yourself within the strength of faith, within strength of determination, however you want to phrase it. You'd be building it on the rock. You wouldn't be doubting. You wouldn't just be building a house because I told you to build a house. You'd be building it where I told you to build it. You'd be building it in the right place, facing the right directions, using the right materials. You're not just building a house all willy-nilly you're doing. And so if we were to apply that to our faith, you're not living your life just, well, you said to do good things, so I'm just going to do generally good things. No, Jesus has, in this passage, said there are specific good things, and it goes to a point, and it's very poignant, and there's a purpose behind this. You're not just giving because it makes you feel good. You're giving because I've told you to give. I've told you to give more. Not just because you like how little Susie's face lit up when you gave her that extra money. You're giving because it's building your heart. It's building off of something that I'm doing within you. And so it's the idea of two people are building a house, and they're told the same instructions. One builds it the right way on the rock and the foundation, well built, and the other one builds it really quickly. It's kind of like the Three Little Pigs. You have the two who rush through building their house, and the one who built his house the right way, like a house. And the big bad wolf destroys the lazy, those who weren't really cool. Well, we built a house. Well, you did and you didn't at the same time. And so, but it's the one who built the house the right way, who did his due diligence, that is rewarded. So.
I'd like to share a quote from a book I've been reading. The name of the title of the book is Let All the Earth Keep Silent by Phil Sanders. But he keeps coming back to a central theme, and he uses this as part of his illustration. But it says the principle of obedience is that man must lovingly, completely, carefully, diligently, and accurately obey God.
Yes.
And that statement, he comes back to it over and over in the book. It makes a big impact.
Say that one more time. Diligent.
It says the principle of obedience is that man must lovingly, completely, carefully, diligently, and accurately obey God. I'm going to see if I can find. I haven't found the book in print currently, but I was reading off the text I sent to you.
Well, the key in that story though was verse 47. I'll show you what he was like who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice. Because then Luke didn't write this with chapters, and so during that story, he illustrates that very thing with the Gentile.
Yeah.
It's only twice in the Gospels it says Jesus was amazed. And here is in verse 9 of chapter 7, he's amazed at the Gentile who had faith. In Mark chapter 6, verse 6, he's amazed at Jews who do not.
Yes. Very good point, and
What words is he talking about?
I'm sure,
What words, here's my words and accents, the ones that you just said.
Say that again, Chess.
Well, it says, he said that it hinges on 47. Everyone who comes to me, here's my words and accent. What words is he talking about? Well, at least from Luke's perspective, he's talking about
What he just said.
the Beatitudes, the stuff he just said. Love your enemy, don't judge.
the question I've suggested we close on is, are we guilty of judging one another too harshly instead of love? So that's kind of how I've foreseen this class closing out.